Chapter 1. The reason for this title. I never even thought about the blanket until I spread out the paper and picked up my pen to write. Should I write about flowers? Or maybe about how my life is going these days? My thoughts were all over the place, and I couldn't focus. Then I remembered a diary the someone had sent me. I had planned to copy a few passages from it. So I looked for the diary, flipped through its pages, sat at my desk, and picked up my pen. I started writing under the title XX and XX, but after a few lines, I felt my ankle bone pressing against the hard floor. Every time I moved, it was uncomfortable and hard to endure. On top of that, I didn't like how my freshly washed clothes were getting dirty on the dusty floor. The warm spring sun was shining, and I felt sleepy. But my thoughts kept drifting, and sitting cross-legged made my ankle ache against the hard floor. Because of this, I couldn't think or sit still. However, since I had a deadline, I couldn't just do nothing. So I came up with a simple idea to sit on the blanket while writing. The blanket wasn't anything expensive or very clean, but I thought that if I sat on it, my ankle won't feel uncomfortable and my clothes won't get dirty from the floor. But when I folded it and sat on it, my mind wasn't satisfied because it felt too big and too thin. I unfolded the blanket, folded it 3 times lengthwise, and then 3 times sideways. As I folded it 6 times, a brief image flashed before my eyes, just like a sudden thought crossing my mind. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling a strange ache inside. Sitting there blankly, my thoughts drifted back to the past. I couldn't bear to let these thoughts fade away, so I decided to write them down here. That's how I came to name the piece The Blanket. Chapter 2. The Red Blanket. 3 years ago, during the coldest days of the winter, when I left home, I was staying at a large, remote temple. It was a time when I huddled against the cold, trying to endure it. One day, my elderly mother, who was living in hometown, sent me the blanket that became the title of this piece. Since then, this blanket has always been with me, wrapping me, covering me, and supporting me. It has never left my side. Every time I touch it, I felt something deep inside. That feeling is what I have expressed in this writing. It has been with me ever since. I used to work at a train station near the border. At the time, the job seemed tough, but looking back, those days felt more meaningful and happier than my life now. I had my mother, my wife, and even my little daughter. My wife carefully washed my clothes, and though they weren't new, she kept them clean and fresh. Every day, from dawn to night, I worked hard at my job. After that, I would come home, enjoy a warm meal, and rest in comfort. Now, my life feels as uncertain as leaves trembling in the cold wind, making those past days seem even more precious. More than anything, I still vividly remember how my little daughter would light up with a bright smile every time she saw me, morning and evening. However, life was not comfortable at that time. We were living hand to mouth, and if I took even one day off due to illness, we had to borrow just to be able to buy that day's meals. We couldn't even afford decent clothes, and when my wife went out, even the baby carrier for carrying our daughter was worn out. At that time, there was a man named K who, like us, was also living in a rented house nearby. He worked at the station just as I did, and his wife often visited our home. Whenever K's wife came over, our house was filled with the sounds of children quarreling and crying. My daughter and K's son would always end up arguing or bursting into tears. The reason for their trouble was always a red blanket that K's wife used to carry her son. When K's wife came and untied the blanket to put the child down, my daughter, who had been nursing in her mother's arms, would suddenly run over. She would grab the red blanket and say, "Mom, it's so pretty, so pretty." She would smile brightly, as if she admired the blanket, wanted to have it, or wished for one of her own. Then K's son would frown at her, as if to say, "Hey, why are you taking my blanket?" and rush over to snatch it back. However, my daughter won't give up so easily. She clenched her teeth and pulled back with all her strength. As they kept falling and pushing, it would eventually turn into hitting and fighting. At first, when the children started tugging at the blanket, my mother, my wife, and I smiled at each other. But behind our smiles, a slight uneasy feeling passed through, leaving a faint bitterness in our hearts. K's wife was the only one who kept smiling happily. When my daughter was pulled while tugging at the blanket, her face would turn red and she would look at the adult, pouting as if she were about to cry. It was her way of asking for help. K's son also made the same face whenever he was the one being pulled. Eventually, as they got tangled up and started fighting for real, the smiles on the adult faces slowly disappeared. K's wife flushed red with anger and cried out, "How dare a girl lay a hand on my precious son?" She then quickly put her son and the blanket into her arms. Seeing this, my wife's face also turned red as she said, "Don't cry, don't cry. Next time, your father will buy you a blanket." Then she picked up our Dora and nursed her. At times like this, no matter how much she tried to comfort her, my Dora's crying didn't stop easily. Kay's wife looked visibly frustrated, clearly showing her displeasure. When this happened, I couldn't bear to watch, even though both our family and Kay's were struggling just as much. I couldn't help but feel that Kay's wife had a sense of superiority. Just that was enough to upset me. But what made it worse was thinking about how we were struggling so much that we couldn't even afford a proper baby wrap for our child. It filled me with deep shame. And when my little daughter, too young to speak properly, could only point at the blanket and cry, all I could do was watch. My heart ached so much that it was hard to endure. Chapter 3. The Blanket. A few days later, I came home after receiving my wages and found my wife sitting and crying while holding out Dora with a towel wrapped around her head. My mother sat beside them, silently smoking a cigarette. I widened my eyes in shock and asked, "What happened?" "My girl got hurt on the head. My mother boiled his pork. A boy is struggling to come out." "What? Hurt on the head? What do you mean?" My mother spoke again. "Kay-san hit her with a flat iron just because she touched the blanket." This time, my wife, crying, said, "With a flat iron." A surge of emotion took over, and I stormed out the door without thinking. My mother ran after me, grabbing my arm. "Hey, they're just kids. Don't let this turn into a fight between adults." I stopped in my tracks, unable to move. At that moment, I didn't know if I felt anger or sorrow. I was in a daze, like someone who had lost all sense of reality. As my emotions slowly settled, and I finally came back to myself, I realized my face was wet with tears, and my chest felt painfully tight. I ran straight to the market and bought a blanket with red, yellow, and blue stripes for 41 and 50 yuan. I didn't even know where I got the strength to rush there so quickly. But as I turned to head home with the blanket in my hands, I suddenly realized that I had spent all our money for food. At the same time, I thought, it's just a little money. It doesn't even matter. Somehow, it felt like such a small thing. The blanket I'm sitting on as I write this. This is the one I bought that day. When I walked into the house with the blanket, my daughter, who had been sitting on her mother's lap, crying, "Mom, it hurts. It hurts here," while pointing to her head, suddenly rushed over and hugged the blanket tightly. "Mom, Mom, it's so pretty." She laughed with pure joy, jumping up and down with excitement, singing her like that. The three of us, my mother, my wife, and I, wiped away our tears, looked at each other, then turned our heads away. That pain pierced my heart at that moment. Even now, I feel that same pain inside me. Chapter 4. A Letter. Not long after that, a terrible storm struck our home. Our family was separated, with some going east and others west. My mother took my daughter and went to our hometown. My wife went to Pyongan-do, and I entered a temple in Nyangju. While wandering without a trace, I finally settled in the temple and wrote a letter to my mother. She replied, "How are you enduring the cold winter? Make sure to sleep under a blanket. Your daughter used to adore the blanket so much that she won't even let others touch it. But when I told her we are sending it to your father, she quietly handed it over, saying, 'Grandma, will it keep Daddy warm? I hope you achieve your goal soon and return home.' Along with the letter, she sent me the blanket. That was 3 years ago. Since then, my dear daughter, who once owned this blanket, has become a soul laid to rest beneath the earth. My aging mother struggles alone in the bitter cold of a land far from where I am, and I, too, continue to drift with lingering sorrow. When will I ever return to my mother's embrace? Now, as spring deepens, I sit with this old, familiar blanket wrapped around me. A wave of emotions washes over me, leaving me at a loss for words.